When a talk show host crosses the line with an inappropriate remark, legendary actor Anthony Hopkins delivers a calm yet devastating response that leaves the entire audience stunned. What starts as a routine interview quickly turns into an unforgettable moment as Hopkins masterfully puts the host in their place. Watch as the crowd erupts in wild applause, proving that true class and wit always win in the end. The stage lights were bright. The cameras rolled. The audience murmured with excitement. It was supposed to be just another night on the late hour with James Carter, the most popular talk show in America. The host, James Carter, was known for his sharp tongue, his bold jokes, and sometimes his lack of respect. Tonight he had a legend sitting across from him, Sir Anthony Hopkins. The Oscar-winning actor, now in his 80s, sat with a calm and dignified presence. His piercing blue eyes held decades of wisdom. The audience leaned forward, eager to hear him speak. But no one was ready for what was about to happen. James Carter smirked. He loved pushing boundaries, and tonight, he wanted to get a reaction. "So, Anthony," he said, tapping his pen on the desk, "you've played so many dark roles. Do you ever wonder if, deep down, you're actually just like them?" The room went silent. The question was cruel, insulting. Anthony didn't flinch. He simply stared at James with a look so powerful, so intense, that the air in the studio became heavy. A storm was coming. For a long moment, Anthony said nothing. He simply sat there, his face unreadable. The audience held their breath. James Carter shifted in his seat. He had expected a chuckle, maybe a witty comeback, but now he felt uneasy. Then finally, Anthony leaned forward, resting his hands gently on the table. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "James," he said softly, "there is something very dangerous about a man who believes cruelty is entertainment." The audience gasped. James's smirk disappeared. He opened his mouth to respond, but Anthony continued, his voice never rising. "You see, I have spent my life understanding the depths of human nature," Anthony said. "I have played monsters, villains, broken men. But do you know what truly frightens me?" James swallowed hard. "What?" he asked, his voice suddenly small. Anthony's eyes never wavered. "Men who do not know the difference between a character and a soul." A single clap echoed from the audience, then another, and another, until the entire room erupted in applause. James Carter looked around, realizing he had lost control of his own show. Tears. They came from an old woman sitting in the front row. Then another man in the audience wiped his eyes. Something about Anthony's words had touched them, deeply, but Anthony wasn't finished. "You see, James," he continued, "age teaches you something that arrogance never will: humility." James shifted uncomfortably. Anthony smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing one. "I have met many men like you," he said. "Men who mistake mockery for wit, who think that making others feel small makes them look big." The audience was dead silent now. James's hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. I didn't mean any harm," he muttered. Anthony sighed, looking at the young host with something close to pity. "Do you know what a man regrets at the end of his life?" Anthony asked, his voice suddenly softer. James didn't answer. He couldn't. The words he cannot take back. And just like that, James Carter, one of the most confident men in television, lowered his head. A single tear slipped down his cheek, and the world watched, breathless. James Carter swallowed hard. He had never felt this exposed on his own show. The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, and yet, he felt completely alone in that moment. Anthony Hopkins sighed, looking at James as though he were looking through him. "You remind me of a boy I once knew," he said softly. The audience leaned in. Even the crew stopped what they were doing. "He was a boy full of pride, full of arrogance," Anthony continued. "He believed the world owed him something. He laughed at the weak. He mocked the old. And then one day life humbled him." James shifted in his seat. his confidence fading by the second. "What happened?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Anthony paused, his blue eyes clouded with memory. "He lost everything," he said. "His father, his mother, his wife. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw not a man, but a ghost of who he once was." A woman in the audience sobbed. James opened his mouth, but nothing came out, because for the first time in his life he was afraid of the answer. James cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. That's a sad story," he muttered, forcing a smile. "But I don't see what it has to do with—" Anthony leaned forward. "Do you know who that boy was, James?" James frowned. "Who?" Anthony's voice dropped to a whisper. "Me." The air in the studio turned heavy. James's smirk disappeared. The audience gasped. "You see, James," Anthony continued, "I was not always the man you see today. I was once arrogant. I was once foolish. I was once lost." James looked down. He could feel the weight of Anthony's words pressing on him. "But life does not allow men like that to stay the same," Anthony said. "It breaks them. It tears them apart until they learn." The audience sobbed. Anthony took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "And do you know the hardest part?" he asked. James shook his head. Anthony's voice was barely above a whisper. "The regret. The knowledge that I can never undo the words I spoke. That I can never say, 'I'm sorry' to the people who are already gone." James blinked, his vision blurring, because in that moment he realized this wasn't just a lesson. This was a warning. The studio was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, not the kind of silence that comes from awkwardness, but the kind of silence that comes when people realize they will never be the same again. James Carter, the man who had made a career out of talking, could not find a single word to say. Anthony Hopkins sat still, his old hands resting gently on his lap. He had not raised his voice. He had not insulted James, but he had won. And then, a single clap echoed in the room, then another, until the entire studio erupted into the loudest applause in the history of the show. People were crying, holding their faces in their hands, clutching their chests, because Anthony Hopkins had not just spoken to James Carter, he had spoken to all of them. To every man who had ever regretted his words, to every woman who had ever wished for one more chance to say, "I love you," to every soul who had ever felt the weight of time pressing down on them. And as James Carter wiped his eyes, one thought filled his mind. He would never forget this night, and neither would the world. James Carter sat frozen in his chair. The weight of Anthony Hopkins' words pressed on his chest like an iron hand. The audience had stopped clapping now. The room was silent again, except for the quiet sounds of people sniffling. A woman in the second row dabbed at her eyes. An older man in the back wiped his glasses, his hands shaking. But Anthony wasn't finished. "You see, James," he said gently, "I spent years chasing something that never mattered. Fame, recognition, approval." James swallowed hard. "And while I was chasing that," Anthony continued, his voice calm yet powerful, "I forgot the people who truly mattered. The ones who loved me when I had nothing. The ones who held me up when I was falling apart." A deep sadness crossed Anthony's face. "And then one day I turned around." He exhaled. "And they were gone." James looked down at his desk, his fingers gripping the wood. Anthony shook his head. "Do you know the worst part of being old, James?" James barely whispered. "What?" Anthony's eyes filled with something rare. "Regret. It's knowing that no matter how much you wish for it, you can never go back." The audience wept. A young man in the audience wiped his face. A grandmother clutched her heart. James Carter, the talk show host who never lost control, felt something inside him crack. Anthony took a slow breath. His hands were steady now. "There is a moment," he said, "when you realize you will never see someone again. You do not always know it's the last time, but later you look back and you remember that moment." James blinked rapidly. His throat felt tight. "The last time you heard their voice," Anthony whispered. "The last time they laughed. The last time they told you they loved you." A woman in the audience sobbed. Anthony closed his eyes for a second, his face full of pain. "And then you wake up one day more, and the phone will never ring again." James swallowed, his hands shaking. He had lost his mother years ago. He remembered the last time he spoke to her. The last words he said were rushed, thoughtless. And then, she was gone. Anthony looked at James now, his eyes sharp but full of sorrow. "You still have time, James," he said softly. "Use it well." James lowered his head, and for the first time in his career he had nothing to say. James gripped his chair. His heart was racing. He had built his career on confidence, on control. But this was something else. He licked his lips, trying to steady himself. Then he looked at Anthony. I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his voice small. "I was just trying to be funny." Anthony gave a sad smile. "Funny," he repeated. James nodded quickly. "Yeah, jokes, entertainment." Anthony's smile faded. "James, there is a fine line between a joke and a wound," he said. "And the cruelest thing about wounds is that sometimes you don't know you've made one until it's too late." James's breath caught. "Did you ever say something?" Anthony asked, "that you wished you could take back?" James's vision blurred. He remembered it clearly. His mother had called him, excited about something small, a story she wanted to tell, and he had cut her off. "I'm busy, Mom, I'll call you later." But later never came. She died the next morning, and her voice, her laughter, was gone forever. James closed his eyes, his chest aching. Anthony watched him carefully. "It's never too late to learn," he whispered, "but it's always too late to go back." James's hands trembled, and the audience, they were crying, because they too had lost people. They too had words they wished they could take back, and every single one of them felt it. Deeply, James Carter could barely breathe. His hands felt cold, his throat was dry. He had spent years talking over people, talking without thinking, talking just to fill the silence. But now, silence had swallowed him whole. Anthony Hopkins sat still, watching him. His face held no anger, no smugness, only understanding. James opened his mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Because what do you say when you realize you've been wrong your whole life? He thought about his mother again. The phone call he ended too soon. The way she had hesitated before hanging up. Had she known? Had she felt it would be their last conversation? He blinked back tears. The audience could feel it, every single one of them. They weren't just watching a talk show anymore, they were watching a man break apart. And Anthony? He was simply waiting. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. James Carter stood up suddenly. The audience gasped. His heart was pounding. He couldn't stay still. The cameras were rolling, but he didn't care. I need a break, he muttered. But Anthony's voice stopped him. "Running will not bring them back, James." James froze. Anthony's words hit him like a hammer to the chest. Slowly, James turned around. His hands were shaking. His breathing was shallow. I don't know how to fix it," James whispered. "She's gone, and I never told her. I never told her I was sorry." Anthony nodded slowly. "I understand." James clenched his jaw. "Do you?" A sad smile crossed Anthony's lips. "I once wrote a letter," he said softly, "to my father, but I never sent it." The room held its breath. Anthony's voice was gentle, yet filled with a pain that had lived in his bones for decades. "I thought I had time," he whispered. James swallowed hard. What did it say? Anthony's hands folded together. His voice barely rose above a whisper. It said, I love you. I wish I'd said it more. A woman in the front row burst into tears because she too had someone she wished she had told that to. James Carter sat down. His legs felt weak. His head spun. The audience was no longer watching a talk show. They were watching something much deeper. James wiped his face. She called me that night. I should have talked longer. Anthony nodded. Yes. James clenched his jaw. I should have visited more. Anthony nodded again. Yes. James's voice cracked. I should have hugged her tighter. Anthony took a deep breath. Yes, James. You should have. James broke. Tears spilled down his face. He didn't care who saw. He wasn't the confident host anymore. He wasn't the man who always had the last laugh. He was just a son who missed his mother. The audience sobbed with him. Because they understood. Because they had been there too. Anthony watched him, his own eyes glistening. You can't change the past, he said gently. But you can change what you do with the time you have left. James looked up, and for the first time in his life, he understood. James Carter's hands trembled as he looked at Anthony Hopkins. The audience was silent except for the quiet sounds of people crying. James wiped his face, shaking his head. I don't know what to do with this guilt. Anthony's eyes softened. You carry it. You learn from it. But you do not let it destroy you. James exhaled shakily. But it hurts. Anthony nodded. Yes, it does. And it always will. The words sliced through the room. An older man in the audience wiped his eyes. A woman clutched her chest, remembering her own unfinished goodbyes. James took a deep breath. I just wish I had told her how much I loved her. Anthony leaned forward. Then tell her now. James blinked, confused. She's gone. Anthony placed a hand on his heart. But you are still here. The audience wept. James inhaled sharply. Could she still hear him? He had never believed in things like that before, but right now he wanted to. More than anything. James Carter pressed his palms into his face. He had spent years mocking emotions, dismissing them, avoiding them. But now, emotion had caught up with him, and it was drowning him. Anthony's voice was calm. If you could say one last thing to her, James, what would it be? James broke. His shoulders shook, his chest heaved. He gripped the desk to steady himself. The audience watched, holding their breath. Finally, James lifted his head. His eyes were red. His voice cracked. I would tell her I was wrong. A woman in the audience sobbed. James looked up at Anthony, his face crumbling. I would tell her I should have been there more. Anthony's lips pressed together. He nodded. James exhaled sharply. I would tell her I love her. And then, the strongest man on television wept like a child. And across the world, watching on their screens, people cried with him. The studio was flooded with tears. People hugged each other. Some held their heads in their hands. Even the camera crew had tears running down their faces. James Carter sat back, exhausted. It felt as if something had been ripped out of him. Anthony watched him carefully. He had seen this before. He had felt this before. A man confronting his greatest regret. James wiped his face. What now? Anthony gave him a small, knowing smile. Now, you make sure you don't waste the time you have left. James stared at him, and then, for the first time in his life, he truly understood. The studio was still silent. James Carter, the man who had built his career on fast words and sharp jokes, sat motionless. His heart was pounding. Anthony Hopkins had done something no one had ever done before. He had made James see himself. James exhaled shakily. His voice was weak, but there was something new in it. I don't want to live with regret. Anthony nodded, his blue eyes filled with understanding. Then don't. James swallowed. But she's gone. Anthony tilted his head. She may be gone, James, but you're not. James looked up, confused. Anthony leaned forward, his voice soft yet powerful. Your mother isn't the only person in your life who needs to hear those words. James blinked, and suddenly, he saw it. His father, his brother, his wife, his children, all the people he had pushed aside, people he had forgotten to love properly. James felt his chest tighten. It wasn't too late. Not for them. The room felt different now. Lighter. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because he had faced it. James Carter took a deep breath. His hands were still shaking, but he didn't try to hide it anymore. He turned to Anthony. His lips parted, but no clever remark came. No joke, no defense, just gratitude. Thank you, James whispered. Anthony smiled. It's never too late to be better, James. The audience erupted. A standing ovation. People clapped, cried, and cheered. Not for a dramatic moment, not for entertainment, but because they felt it, the truth of it, the weight of it. James Carter stood and, for the first time in his career, he didn't soak in the applause. Instead, he turned to Anthony Hopkins and hugged him. The room wept, because sometimes words are not enough. Sometimes only the heart can speak. The cameras had stopped rolling. The audience had left. But James Carter sat still, staring at his hands. Anthony Hopkins placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You have a choice now, he said. James looked up. Anthony's voice was soft but firm. You can go back to who you were, or you can become the man you wish you had been all along. James's throat tightened. His mind raced. And then, he knew. He picked up his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then a voice answered. Dad? James Carter broke down. Tears streamed down his face. He had spent years avoiding this call. But tonight, he made it. And somewhere in the silence, he felt it. His mother was smiling. The end. Before you go, if this story touched your heart, please do one thing for me. Like this video if it made you feel something deep. Subscribe so you never miss another story like this. Comment below. Who is the one person you wish you could call right now? Let's honor them. Let's love while we still can. Thank you for watching, and remember, it's never too late to say I love you.